Welcome back to another video, and in this video we're going to be continuing on with our core data tutorial series, and in this particular tutorial we are going to be taking a look at how we can set up a macOS application using AppKit that uses core data as its persistence sort of layer. So what I want you to do is first launch Xcode as you would for anything else. All right. Once you launch Xcode, we're going to create a new project. And then under platform, we're going to select the platform as macOS. Now, one thing I do need to emphasize here is that we're using Xcode 16.2, although this should work the same. In fact, it will work the same in Xcode 16.0. I'm not sure if anything about this process, if anything, will change in later Xcode versions, because as of recording, 16.2 is the most recent version of Xcode. So let's go ahead, and once you have macOS selected as your platform, go into the template chooser right beneath it and select App. Then go ahead and just do any product name you would like. It doesn't particularly matter. We'll say Tutorial App Mac AppKit Core Data. That's what I'm doing here. And then we will say storyboard as the interface, Swift for the language, none for the testing system, and then core data for storage. Now you'll see a checkbox that says host in CloudKit. Do not check that checkbox, because as I mentioned in the first video of the series, we are not going to do CloudKit integration in this series. That is way beyond the scope of this introductory series meant to get you started with core data. If you need a series on CloudKits, this isn't the place, because I'm not going to do one. But there are plenty of other resources out there that will teach you CloudKit, or at least the basics of how to integrate with it. All right, so let's go ahead, and after you've selected all of your presets, go ahead and hit Next, and select a place where you want to store your project, and then hit Create. All right, so here we are inside of our macOS application. The next thing we need to do is we need to go into our app delegate file. So we want the app delegate file. And what we need is all the way down here at the bottom of the file. All right, so what I'm going to do here is we're going to go up above this. All right, so let's go ahead and go to the function signature and take a look at what that looks like. Let's see here. All right, so here we have application should terminate, we're going to modify this slightly as we move forward. So we're going to preemptively change this to accommodate the changes that we're going to make. And instead of saying let context equals persistent container dot view context, we are going to say let context equals data controller dot container dot view context. Container dot view context. All right. And then we'll just leave this as is, because right here there's nothing else we need to change. Now, if we go above this function here, all right. So application should terminate, if you're unfamiliar, basically says, hey, should the application terminate, right? If something goes wrong, then yes, it should terminate. But we don't have to worry too much about what happens in here. If we go above here, we get another method. And what this will do is it'll return sort of the undo manager of our managed object context, which allows us to do some undo support. Here is, instead of returning a persistent container.view context, we'll say data controller dot container dot view context. View context dot undo manager. So our managed object context, like I mentioned in the first video of the series, does support redoing and undoing changes that you have made to your underlying data store. And that's where this undo manager is coming from. All right. So now, okay, here we go. Func save. We want to copy everything in here, but first we're going to remove all of the comments. So get rid of those comments. We don't need to worry about if context dot commit editing. We can just remove that entirely. It's not technically required, so we're not going to use it here. And then we're going to get rid of these comments here. Now, one thing you should keep in mind when you are saving or doing any core data operation that can throw any errors, you should always handle that error appropriately in your user interface. So that means, for example, presenting an alert to the user, letting them know that something went wrong. Because if you just have a fatal error call or you're printing it to a console or something like that, the user isn't going to know what the heck went wrong. They're not going to know that anything did go wrong. They're going to assume that everything's hunky-dory unless something in the user interface itself, like the UI not updating or something like that, hints that something actually did go wrong. So always make sure that in a real-world application, you convey to the user that something went wrong. How you do it is up to you. All right. Yeah, I guess that's fine. What we'll do then here is we will we'll go ahead and copy this code here. And then we want to copy this lazy variable above it. All right, so here we go. We will cut this out. We will save this, and then at the top of our app delegate, we will say let data controller equals data controller. We'll save this, and now we actually want to create our data controller class. So when you do a command N, go ahead and select Swift file. And I'm going to call it data controller, like that. And now, after we import foundation, we are going to import core data. After we import core data, we will actually create that class, data controller. And inside of our data controller, we will paste in what we cut out of the app delegate. Now, let's go over what exactly this code does, because that is very important. I'm going to get rid of these comments up here, because they're not necessary. All right. So here we have a lazy variable called persistent container. However, we're going to change that to container. And you may notice that as mentioned previously, we are creating this as a lazy variable. Why? Well, the reason why this is a lazy variable is because we only want to load our persistent container when it's absolutely necessary. We don't want to delay load times more than we have to. So we are going to load it only when we absolutely have to. Now we're gonna get rid of these. We're gonna go ahead and get rid of the comments in here as well. Now, the first line of code that we see is we see let container equals ns persistent container with a name being passed to it. Now, what is this name that gets passed to our ns persistent container? Well, this is the name of the core data model file that core data will use to generate our underlying SQLite persistent store. Because when we're dealing with core data, by default, it uses SQLite. And because core data is an ORM, or object relational mapper, it goes and takes this data model and creates that database for us based on what are called entities and their attributes, as well as relationships between those entities. We'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward through the series, but we're not going to worry about that too much in this video. I'm only going to talk in reference to the data model as necessary when we need to understand a specific concept. All right. So after we created our NS persistent container object, we then attempt to actually load that persistent store. I'm going to add a new line in between that so it looks nicer. What this method is going to do is it's going to try to load the persistent store. If it can't find it, it will attempt to create it. And there are many things that could happen that may cause an error. For example, the parent directory that the core data persistent store is supposed to be put inside of may not exist. You may not have write permissions to the given directory. You may not have enough storage on your Mac. Stuff like that can cause this call to fail. And if we take a look at the call to load persistent stores, we have two parameters passed to its completion handler. And those two parameters are pretty much the first being a instance of NS store description, which is just an object meant to provide information describing the persistent store, and then an error object. This error is optional because this call to load persistent stores may or may not fail. So if it's nil, we know it went okay. We know everything's fine. But if it is nil, or if it isn't nil, rather, if it has a value, then we know that something went wrong and we should let the user know as much. So that's what this particular if-let statement in here is doing. I'm not going to go over basic if-let syntax because you should know it by now. If you're learning core data, you should be familiar with how this works. But what we're doing here is, again, we're making sure that there's an error, and if there is, we cause the application to crash with a call to fatal error. So I'm going to also get rid of these comments. Let's see here. Okay, there we go. All right. So here we go. And so we're pretty much just giving a fatal error here with some information about the error. And then after all of that, we are returning our container. So we only return the container if nothing went wrong. All right. Now here we have a function called save, and this is what we're going to use to save the changes in our managed object context. Now, of course, if you recall from the previous videos, from in particular the first video, the managed object context is what tracks and manages our unsaved changes. So that's why we have to first, inside of this method, retrieve our view context, which we do need to change slightly. Instead of persistent container, it'll be container. So our persistence container contains a property called view context, and that is what allows us to do, that's what allows us to retrieve our managed object context and then do whatever we need to do with it. Then, once we have our view context, we are seeing whether or not there are any unsaved changes. And this is important because when you're working with core data, you're not going to want to do additional work unless it's absolutely necessary. Because if you don't have any changes that need to be saved, and you call save, you're doing a whole bunch of unnecessary work. So you should only do that work when you have to. And that's what this if check makes sure that's what this if check is there to make sure of. If we have changes that are unsaved, then perform a save. And then here we are getting that error from our catch, and we are casting it to an NS error. Now, the reason why we have to cast this to an NS error is because of the fact that core data is originally written in Objective-C. It's almost 20 years old. And we didn't have an error object in Objective-C. We had NS error. So in some instances with core data, it really does show its age in that respect. So we do have to use some Objective-C era things from within Swift in order to make things work. All right. So with that, we now have our data controller. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our issue navigator just to make sure that there are no errors. If there are, we can go ahead and fix them. So issues. Okay. So what we want to do here then is we can also just get rid of that and say fatal error unresolved error NSError.userinfo. And then we can also just give it the NSError object like that. All right. So there shouldn't be any more errors. Let's go ahead and save our code and run it just to make sure that the application actually runs. And we have a successful build. All right. The application is trying to load, doing its thing here. And here it is. So here's our window. It's just a blank window because there's no user interface controls inside of the UI. It's just a blank view controller. All right, so that pretty much does it for this video on how we can set up core data in an AppKit based application. Thank you all so very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.